This episode is sponsored by the IoT Job Site, the world's only dedicated space for applying for and advertising IoT vacancies across the world. Register now for job alerts or get in touch via let's talk at theiotjobsite.com.
Welcome back to the IoT podcast show. I'm your host, Tom White. Today we're joined by Matt Belachew. Matt is the CEO and founder of Wearme. Wearme is a smart platform that enables wearable developers to build and sell their devices. Before we get into it, guys, could you do me a favour? Could you like, comment and subscribe to the show? You'll get notified when there's a new episode. And as always, I don't care how you're connected, just as long as you're connected. Matt, welcome to the IoT podcast show.
Thank you, Tom. Really happy to be here.
Well, you're very welcome to be here, and it's great to see you. In fact, I'm really interested personally on this. I know a lot of the listeners and viewers know that I'm a big fan of wearables and have countless wearables adorning my body. So I'm interested to know more about yourself. So, as usual, love to kick off. Can you explain a little bit about your background and also your company, Wearme?
Sure. All right. So basically, it's funny, how actually things turned out, because I think it was in the year 2005, for no apparent reason, I basically packed up and, came to China. Currently, actually, I think I told you this, I'm tuning in from Shanghai, China. And so what happened was I landed in Guangdong province, which is actually right next to Hong Kong, which is actually, a couple hours, by train. And Guangdong is the electronics capital of the world. Like any PCBs, any, smart wearables that you have, I am 100% sure at least they have, a few components that were made in, if not, entirely made in Guangdong. Even, Apple actually get their, phones actually, they used to get them done there. So basically, that was when, when I came to China, that's when I got exposed to, the whole situation. So I got into hardware, especially, like I'm a computer programmer by trade. And so I kind of got into hardware in early 2011. I was working on a project called Project Mirror, which was actually, it was a smart mirror, something like, Peloton and, the other guys are trying to do now. But we were using actually computer vision, using MATLAB, and we had actually about 400 data points. And a pedestal where you stand in, and it actually has like the $10,000 scanners. These are like, the ones that you see in airports now, that actually, scan your body like in under 2 seconds. And so basically this mirror had a wearable component. And so that's when I got into wearables, which, especially in those days in 2011, was really at its infancy. I mean, if people were actually wearing, a smartwatch, people would, basically be blown off. Like, I mean, people were talking about the latest, pardon my French, but farting apps and, all those types of, everybody was into apps. But that was when, I got into wearables, which is actually, very challenging that time, because there weren't many, sensors that are available as now. And also things were, very, very expensive. Like, according to the latest data that I have, actually since 2011, if you compare 2011 to 2020, the cost of, parts, and especially parts that go into wearables, has declined by 70%. This is 70. So basically, right now is actually, time for wearables, but back then in 2011, that was totally unheard of. So that's how, fast forward, that's how I got started. And, fast forward 2019, that's when I founded Wearme, and, gotten serious about it. So currently, we're doing really awesome. We brought a bunch of wearable products to market, and looking forward to the new products that we're going to be turning out in the next uh, few years.
Okay, fantastic. So, come from a computing programming background. Obviously, mentioned MATLAB there,
Yeah,
various sort of hardware languages, etc.
yeah,
And then decided to found Wearme in 2019. Obviously, the cost of components obviously come down to 2011 to 2020. That stat you said 70%. One would imagine they've gone back up again with the recent supply chain shortages,
yeah, yeah,
if you can get hold of them.
yeah.
So what does Wearme actually produce then? Can you talk a little bit about, you've got products out there in the market, or is it R&D at the moment?
Yes, yes. So basically, just to give you how Wearme actually got started, it was actually born out of the frustration that I actually went through while trying to consult a few startups that were actually hardware startups. And as I said, in 2011, I kind of touched on it, but it was too early. And, you would imagine by 2018, 2019, you would imagine that, I mean, these problems have been solved. But, I found out that, it was still that difficult. Like, I mean, getting started, a bunch of people that I was talking to, these are actually, small and medium sized wearable, designers, have no idea where to start. They have no idea, basically, how do you make a wearable? They have really, really awesome, like, I mean, in a sense, these are like wearables that could really change the way we live. Some are like, not to actually, name names, but some wearables are even, way ahead of even, the large companies that are actually, currently, controlling almost 70% of the market. So basically what it is that, so Wearme was, born out of that frustration where, since I already went through this, I do not want, other people to go through the same, sort of situation. So what I did was I kind of leveraged my connections that I have cultivated in the past almost 18 years out here in China. And these are, like factories, these are, engineering companies out here that can actually provide, a real quality service, especially in manufacturing and bringing, the innovative products to market. So basically, that is in a nutshell what we do at Wearme. We help small and medium-sized smart wearable designers to quickly prototype and go to market with their wearable.
Okay, fantastic. And I think you've got a real added advantage from being, is it 18 years now you've been living in China, Matt?
Yes, yes. Almost 18 years now. Actually, coming
Wow.
Valentine's Day.
Okay, right. You moved on Valentine's Day.
Well, that tells you something, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I was lonely.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Well, hopefully you're still not lonely, but if anything, you've got a wearable with you, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
you're never alone with wearables. So just getting into the thick of it a little bit more. So obviously the wearable market is huge. It's growing year by year. You
Yeah.
mentioned the costs of components until recently, of course,
Yes.
were coming down massively.
Yeah.
In terms of devices, what types of devices and the key trends have you seen in particular in the last few years, and what has been most popular?
Oh, okay. Cool. So just to give you what do you say, sort of like for comparison, just a little bit of data here. So basically, currently the wearable industry is now at a $30 billion business. So that was just only, what do you say, 21 billion a year ago. So just in the span of a year, and especially, with COVID and, the current, situation. And despite the fact that, there are, like, what do you say, supply chain crunches, especially, in getting MCUs, still, like, it added almost 30%, year on year growth. And they expect it to reach actually around 60 billion by 2025, 26. So it's a really it's a rocket ship. You know what I mean? Like I mean, it's just going to explode exponentially. And what I've seen so far, especially on Wearme, so basically, during the pandemic, there was, COVID tech related products were pretty popular. This includes like, distancing alarm. These are actually wearables that you have, like, whenever people, if they're worn, like if you wear them and I wear them, then, the moment we come into 3 feet to 6 feet, you can actually set it. It would actually alert, for social distancing, which was, a lot of people actually kind of cashed on that. And also wearables with, what do you say, thermistors, embedded thermistors, like in a sense, one of the, what do you say, one of the symptoms for COVID were actually, fever and everything. So these thermistors, enabled smartwatches were also kind of hot. But these days, a lot of people actually, if I tell you, you're not going to believe this, a lot of people come to Wearme, and the most searched item right now is actually a smart bikini.
Right. Okay.
Smart bikini.
Crikey! I didn't think you were going to say that, mate. I must admit.
No, I know. Like actually, we can even back it up with data. And actually, there's a reason behind that. One of our advisors actually was working with, I think, with Colgate Palmolive, and he worked on, previously on a smart bikini concept where, it has an app and, a UV sensor that kind of tells the person who's actually to actually get inside or wear, what do you say, suntan lotion, on a timely manner based on, the skin tone and, et cetera, and everything. And so he kind of mentioned Wearme. So I guess that's why people actually come to Wearme on his, website. So people come to Wearme, and, what they search is for that. Followed by Smart Sports Bra, the one that we are actually currently working on. That's also heavily searched a while back. Also, we had a smart shoes. So people are actually, what do you say, getting into smart fashion, like in a sense, in fashion tech. But also on the other side, you have like actually sleep tech, which has been, especially, towards, like last end of last year and, early this year. Also, people tend to actually, search for these are like smart masks, like sleeping masks. We also have like these, what do you say, oximeters, like, for sleep deprivation. Like these are health tech. So these sleep tech, I would say sleep tech and, what do you say, health related hardwares have been, actually, getting a much higher attention, these past few days. Yeah.
I mean, I agree and recognise, certainly on the latter part of what you were saying. That's something I've been aware of. Smart textiles in general is quite growing, but the sleep and the health side is really, really important. From a personal point of view, I don't sleep particularly well, and haven't for a while. So I've invested in products like Cocoon and various other earbuds and ways and hearables to improve that, and some are really quite good, right? So I think from a health perspective, monitoring oxygen, monitoring different levels to improve sleep architecture, I think is so important.
Yeah.
And we started off to saying this is quite jovial around the whole smart bikini concept, right? But I think certainly some of the things that we can do here are really fantastic from the sleeping aspect. I mean, something that's really interesting for me, and I know when we were putting together the questions for this show,
Yeah.
is really, how does a company, in your view, stand apart in what is a congested market, right?
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different watches, right? For
Yeah.
instance, there's quite a few different wearables. And I don't know if congested actually is the right word, because
It is
congested is,
swarming. It's
yeah.
swarming. Yeah.
Well, I guess it's relative, isn't it,
Yeah.
to the amount of requirements by
Hmm.
demand,
Yeah.
supply and demand,
Hmm.
basically
Hmm.
speaking, right?
Yeah.
Is it congested? So, what's your view on that, Matt?
Yeah, well, that is actually a really, really, really good question that you raised there. Especially, like everybody knows, these really cheap wearables. You can actually get now a smartwatch for like $5, but it only works like for a week or two, and it stops working. So yeah, like there's a huge competition, like especially as you said, like with the regular what do you say wearables, like these are actually like smartwatches, activity trackers, and to a certain point also like there are in like headphones, earbuds, and so on and so forth, like basically which are actually what we call like first generation type of wearable. And these the key even that for Wearme to exist, like what makes us even what do you say, like we kind of like put it as our main dogma or our own what do you say main doctrine, is that the first thing is we go after quality. Quality is like absolutely important. We did validation research, when I was actually, before founding Wearme, I did a validation research among, smart wearable users. And what I found out is that, especially users in the US, they prefer a good quality, higher price, but, with a more durable, long-lasting smart wearables as compared to, like, for example, here in China, which was actually, a shorter lifespan, and they don't really, they want quality, but not to the U.S. Sort of standard. So since we're an American company, and 95% of our market is actually out there in the U.S. So we actually, quality for each one of our, what do you say, smart wearable designers, that is the first thing that we actually adhere to. And the second thing is, this is one of our motto, you build a wearable to address a problem, not to impress. So we said build to address, not to impress. So it's not just, to show off, cool tech, or, just to say like, hey, we have this type of wearable. No, it's not. We don't build for that. We build so that, we can actually solve a real world problem that is out there, in a sense, that is impactful, that actually solves people's real, what do you say, problem. So that is how you actually, stand out. And also, one last thing is that if you're doing what everybody else is doing, it's really hard to stand out. Like, in a sense, another smartwatch is not going to cut it. But if you come up with, let's say, a smartwatch that is specifically for diet, or for let's say specific type of working out, or for a specific type of, what do you say, like, for example, a fashion statement. There was actually one, a Nubia watch. I don't know if you ever seen it. We were actually working with this company, to help them develop it, which was actually, entirely, the entire, what do you say, the entire thing was an AMOLED screen. So this is like a touch screen that is, everywhere. And it was one of our, like, back in 2019, it was one of our, best sellers. So basically what it is that, if you build to address a real problem, and, if it is a good quality product, then that's not a problem. You will definitely be standing out. But if you're doing everything that everybody else is doing, then, it will be difficult to differentiate and stand out of the crowd.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, thank you for that. I mean, you've come in quite nicely actually to my next question, and I want you to hone down on that a little bit more. So you said about building to address, not to impress. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a great motto, right?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, if it has a utility,
Yes.
then it's useful, and someone's going to use it. In the same way people buy, cryptocurrencies because it has a utility, or an NFT because it has a utility in some form. and the same could be applied to wearables.
Yeah.
To go further, so what more advice would you give someone wanting to develop their own wearable product beyond do it because it solves a problem? What else can they learn from?
Yeah. Okay. Cool. That is also very insightful. Um, so the first thing is like every time when people actually come and talk to me, if they come to Wearme and they say, "Hey, I have an idea and I want to build this type of wearable," so we kind of like actually rate. What do you say the like a success? We kind of calculate like a success factor based on
Okay.
the first thing is how how relatable is what do you say the problem um, that this person is trying to solve. Like, I mean, you should not just build for the sake of building, you know what I mean, and then try to find a problem later. But rather, you need to be able to solve a problem that you have personally experienced, that, you take it personal, that you have already experienced that problem, so that if it is such a problem, you know what I mean, you would have the conviction, the drive, as well as what do you say, the commitment to actually make it happen. Because honestly speaking, building a wearable is not like it's not like making a software or an app. It's a lot more complicated. Like in a sense, it's on the fringe of what do you say between software, data, and also hardware. So you need to have what do you say that type of drive to be able to actually um, that relationship, with the problem.
Hmm.
So that you go on and actually when you solve it, you've got the reason, the drive, and the motivation. And the second thing that I would advise is to build incrementally. Like, not you can't have everything at once, because this is something that I usually have situation with fellow smart wearable designers. Like, they just say, okay, I want this, I want this, I want that, I want this feature, I want this, and I go like, oh, wait a minute, we can't just pack this up. There's such a thing called over packaging. Don't over package. Start with some like really important feature of your product, and then reiterate and build as you go along. With having a clear product what do you say, product map, and also, keeping up with your customer voice. And last but not least would be to prototype before prototype. So this is prototype, which is actually PRETOTYP. Prototyping is actually like the mechanical Turk. Just come up with an innovative way to actually what do you say test your product and validate your product before investing money and time and to get your product built for you, or build it yourself. One example that I actually there's a really nice book. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's called The Right It. I can
No.
actually, I can actually share an Amazon link to get it. It is this is one of the books that I actually demand each one of my colleagues, at Wearme to read, when they join us. It talks like in detail about building a product that, customers love, that customers want, instead of, just, building for the sake of building, and afterwards try to find a problem that actually
Yeah.
fits the product that you actually built.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, hopefully our listeners and viewers, by the time this goes out, there'll be a
Yeah.
link to the comment with that book
Yeah.
there. But I
Yeah.
think that's some really good rules there, right? I think
Yeah.
um, have the drive and the passion to carry on with this idea, because it relates to you. It's a relatable thing, and that's what's going to get it across the line. Have a clear roadmap. Understand exactly where you're going with this. Go to prototype before you prototype to save yourself some money, frankly
Yeah.
speaking, and heartache, time, and everything else that comes with potential a failure in the product. And I think that, yeah, some really good advice there. And I think focus groups as well, right? Asking
Yeah.
people, what do you think about this? Is this going to work out? What are your views? Because again, one might be very passionate about one subject, but it probably isn't relatable to lots of other people. That's it's an interesting concept, right? I think that's good. I think that's absolutely great advice. In terms of that, so lots of people will be going on this journey, and lots of people will be coming to you, Matt. And Wearme is doing some fantastic work. What can we expect? What can we expect to see over the next 5 years in terms of other types of developments? There's lots of talk, but what is definitely going to be happening?
Yeah. Well, in the previous podcast with actually Ashley, we were actually talking about this. Lately, the wearable, industry kind of started to have like these, sub areas. Like, for example, there are like ingestibles. I don't know if you ever heard of these. These are like actually like pill bots. Like, these are robots that actually you can swallow. You ingest them, and they have like camera, and it's like endoscopy, but on a Bluetooth, and an actual thing that actually could be ingested later. This is one very one area that actually has formed, and also like the Neuralink, which is actually one of the other companies that are run by I think Elon Musk. They're trying to actually, put a chip in a human brain, and basically that interacts, and there are like these bionics, that actually exoskeleton and everything that are going to be, developing. Like, in a sense, I expect to see a few more, developments in that area. But if we're talking about, wearables proper, the first thing is that wearables are going to be everywhere and anywhere, and they'll also be more sustainable, less, battery powered, and also more invisible, just like, electricity and, computers are now like these days. Like, back in the days, back in the days, electricity wasn't everywhere, right? But nowadays, when you go to a room, you expect that there is an electricity in there. You know what I mean? So it kind of is, more, built into the infrastructure. So I see that in the future. Like, when you buy a shirt, you would expect it to have, type of sensors that you would expect, like a heart rate sensor, or maybe it would be powered by human sweat, and hand movement, and so on and so forth. And another thing in the wearable proper market that I expect to see in the next 5 years would be a move towards a third generation smart wearables, because currently the most popular wearables are first type or first generation, which are just a Bluetooth connection, and like headphones, just with Bluetooth, and so on and so forth. And I think there will be a transition to generation two. These are type of wearables with their own app, accompanying app. And then the third generation is going to be, wearables with some type of machine learning and AI that is actually, built into them, which makes them truly, truly smart. And finally, there will be an explosion of small and medium-sized wearable designers. This is actually, I don't know if you've seen the stats on Kickstarter and Indiegogo. Like right now, as we speak, there are about 1,500, wearable and IoT, related projects, as we speak, that are, waiting for someone, to fund them. So there's going to be an explosion, and wearables are going to be everywhere.
Yeah, some fantastic advice there, and I think what was really poignant for me was to talk about the second to third generation. So the fact that some of these wearables are going to have their own machine learning and AI built in by design, right? And I think that's really, really important. One of the things that interests me, you talk about Neuralink.
Yeah.
I remember 5-6 years ago when RFIDs was a real big thing, and everyone was like, "RFIDs are going to change the world." Uh, um, people were talking about the fact that you're going to have them under your skin, and that you'll be able to go through,
Yeah.
certain places in the workplace, etc. And that with the whole in how did you say indigestibles concept?
Ingestible. Yes.
Oh, ingestible, of
Yeah.
course, yeah, ingestibles. I think that's really interesting, but also worrying at the same time. And I think a lot of people would be worried.
Yeah.
I think how do you govern the security around that? And that's another really big topic.
Yeah.
To make sure that that's done in the right way, and a whole other conversation, right? Which could spawn for a very, very, very long time. Interesting you should say that. Just in addition to it, obviously Indiegogo, Kickstarter, all of these crowdfunding campaigns,
Yeah.
right? Lots of wearables on there, lots of people looking to go for either angel, seed, or some of them going up to Series A, depending on what they've had already.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice to these companies? I mean, how do you get funding in a congested market? Let alone, you've spoken about how you stand apart, but how would some of these people go and get funding if they've never done it before, right?
Yeah.
They prototype something. What's your advice to them, Matt?
That is a really, really cool question, and we actually have a very detailed, guide on our website on wearme.me.
Okay.
Basically what it is that, when you build, after you validated your idea, then basically you need to build a prototype. Because gone are the days that you just make a video, and a lot of people have been swindled of their money, and so a lot of people do not really trust the videos anymore. So you need to have something there that can actually is a proof of concept that shows that you've already thought about it, you have already ironed out the details. So once you have your prototype, you have two avenues. So the first one is you can actually go for a product crowdfunding, so which is actually using Indiegogo and Kickstarter. But in order to do that, you need to partner with companies that actually could help you achieve that. Currently, we work with multiple of them. Like for example, I don't know if you ever heard of them. Gadget Flow is one such company that we work with. There's also another company called Crowdfunding Formula, and these are actually really reputed companies that actually help smart wearable designers to actually even they would help them validate the idea for a very comparatively low amount of money, very low, and this is like under 10K. They basically would run a campaign, a validation campaign for them, and based on that validation campaign, even some of them they actually connect them with funding opportunities. Like these are actually lenders, based on the success of this validation, they hook them up with lenders who would be able to cover the marketing cost, and especially like the crowdfunding formula, they've raised repeatedly over 100K on each single project. They wouldn't even bother to work if it is type of project that wouldn't reach that amount of success. So what I would say is that is one way. The other way would be to actually go to equity crowdfunding. So this is when you form your company, and basically you raise money from angels and micro VCs, and also accelerators to some degree. That is one where you can actually get the money. But also you need to make sure, though, you need to have a valid idea. Like, in a sense, your idea needs to be really valid, that you have done your work, like in a sense, you did your prototyping, as well as also some type of prototyping, because a lot of investors are scared of hardware investments, and unfortunately, a lot of them are not really familiar with the wearable industry. So they kind of, like, the moment you say we're building a wearable, the first thing that you see is like, oh, sorry, We don't do hardware. But the thing is, wearables are on, what do you say, as I said earlier, on the fringe of hardware, software, and then data. So basically, they're a much, what do you say, easier bet than, purely, hardware, like, building a rocket or, other stuff like that. So as long as you have a clear idea, as long as you have some type of prototype, and as long as you have some type of validation, I think you could easily, raise the money that would be needed in order to bring your product into life.
Matt, fantastic insights. Honestly, really, really, really fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing them. And
You're welcome.
I'll be sure to check out the guide on your website myself, actually, just for my own personal interest. Matt, we're nearing the end of the show. What I wanted to do is ask you a question, actually, from Jonathan Seelig. So Jonathan Seelig is the co-founder of Bridge.
Yeah.
He was on our former episode, our last episode. Jonathan's a big fan of wearables and basically spoke about his passion for wearables and his interest in the market.
Yeah.
One of the things he was wondering about that he wanted to ask you in particular was what kind of infrastructure will be required to support the massive proliferation in IoT devices? Because he's assuming, taking for instance, if you've got a smart pair of running shoes in Stockholm, they're not really going to be relaying that data back to a cloud facility in, say, San Jose. So what does the cloud of the future look like to support the massive amount of wearables that are going to be flooding the market?
Yeah. That is actually that is one of, what do you say, the most sensitive topics in the wearable, what do you say, industry. Like specifically, with the current situation, over there in Europe with GDPR, as well as in California, we have CCTA. There is that, what do you say? There's that part where, data, like especially in China, also they have their own new rules, actually, that rolled out just earlier this year. And what everyone is saying is that, that data needs to stay, within the country. It needs to be anonymized enough so that, there's no identifiable data that is actually stored in, what do you say, a public cloud. So the simplest and, the more straightforward answer that that we, Wearme, what we're actually doing right now is we do not use any cloud at all. Like, so the main reason is this, because when we kind of like, so what we do is like we store the data on the phone itself, like in a sense, the many phones can, have their own, what do you say, built-in storage. And after that, we give, what do you say, in the coming few years, what we want to do is currently store it in the phone. And then after that, we give the option for the user to actually either upload it to, some sort of centralized, what do you say, kind of, what do you call it, a distributed type of, what do you say, storage. Or basically, they can keep like, a back, or some sort of like personal backup facility, like, how they have on Apple has got their, what do you say, the iTunes backup, right, where you pay, a certain storage. So that is the angle that we're actually taking. But with, Web 3.0, currently, that's where everybody is. So I see an opening for some type of distributed and what do you say, blockchain type of technology being employed. The main reason is, like the data will be private. That's the first thing, and also the fact that the person would have the, what do you say, the key to be able to actually provide that data, for others to actually have access to it, or basically to block anyone from accessing that data. So I can see that type of, what do you say, Web3 type of distributed, what do you say, cloud computing that are not really international, but rather more local, what do they call it, like more fragmented, type of cloud, what do you say, infrastructure.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, I mean, fantastic answer. And interesting that you shouldn't be using cloud at the moment, but I understand it. I think privacy laws and what have you does sometimes make this prohibitive. But it'd be interesting to see how we get past this, right?
Yeah.
Matt, thank you for joining us today on the show.
You're welcome.
Honestly, really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Can you just remind us where can people find out more about Wearme? It was wearme.com, is that right?
Wearme.me. Wearme.
Oh, sorry. Wearme.me.
Yeah. Wearme.me. And also, actually, if you just go on Google and you search for smart wearables, Wearme, or Wearme watch, or Wearme, any kind of smart wearable, we usually rank first. So you can find us there as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
You're going to have to give me your SEO consultant's details.
Yeah, we do that.
You're going to need that.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
Matt, thank you for joining us again.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It was really, really awesome talking to you.
Check out our website, theiotpodcast.com, where you can watch all of the previous episodes. It will be great to hear your thoughts on the wearables trend, how this is going to shape the future, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one.